That's pretty funny. Have you ever seen a fainting goat before? You just clap or something like that, and they'll take off running, and fall over. I think that is proof that Darwin did not know what he was talking about. You want to open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 21. That's where we're going to be tonight. We have been studying the book of Exodus for a couple of months. I'll tell you, it's so exciting. I went to my office to get a bottle of water, and those kids are so excited to go to their classes. Well, they're just running and everything, and they can't wait to get down there and stuff. I love that. So I thought, man, wouldn't it be great to see a bunch of adults run into the auditorium? Oh, boy, class. I know, it's not going to happen. I know. But it's... yeah, if we just had that energy, right? Okay. I think you're onto something there. All right, so they're studying Exodus also. In our Last to Leaders program, they are studying the book of Exodus, and I've got to hand it to our teachers. I'll tell you, some of the things that they have to deal with in this, explaining that to small children is quite a challenge, and so I've got to hand it to them. But, even explaining some of this stuff to adults sometimes can be a challenge. Now, especially when you get into where we're going to be in chapter 21, which is the beginning of these more detailed laws that we're going to be getting into. Just to review, we've talked about how you can divide the book of Exodus. You can divide every book up in different ways. But the book of Exodus you can divide up in different ways. And chapters 1 through 6 is whenever they're still in Israel and they are in slavery. They're under the rule of Pharaoh. And then you get to chapter 7 all the way up to 18 is another division. And that is whenever, we call that salvation. That's when Moses comes in and leads them out of Egypt. And you have all those wonderful accounts of parting the Red Sea and all the things that happen with those plagues and things like that. You get into chapter 19, all the way to the end of the book, you get into sanctification. So slavery, salvation, and sanctification. And sanctification meaning set apart. And the way you do that is he is setting this people apart for himself, just like he promised Abraham he was going to do. When you have a brand new nation, hearken back with me to 1776, right here in America. What's the first thing that you have to do? If you're going to start a brand new nation, a constitution, laws, and set up those things that are pertinent to and important for having a nation. That's exactly what God is doing here. So he begins by telling them, if we review real quickly, in chapter 19, verse 5, now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. Please don't ever forget that word. The whole time that you are reading through, really the entire Bible, but especially right now, when you're going into the Mosaical age, you have this pact, this testimony, this covenant, this agreement. That's what that means. And keep my covenant, you shall be my treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. Okay? So then you get into chapter 20, which we talked about for a couple of weeks. Joe talked about it. Last week I talked about it a little bit with the Ten Commandments. We talk about what that entails and that being the basis, really, for all laws. And really, you can break it down to two laws. Anybody remember what that is? Remember in the New Testament, Jesus saying what the greatest commandment is? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second? That's the second of the Ten Commandments, what you just quoted. But you're right on the money there, John, right on the money. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor yourself. Vertical, horizontal. All right? So that's where we're at in verse 20. And then you get into chapter 21, and this is often called the book of the covenant, or the covenant code. Now, what's interesting is everything that you read here all fits into the Ten Commandments. So imagine the Ten Commandments like an umbrella. And all of these codes that we're about to read, this covenant, this principle, these laws, they all fit in the umbrella of the Ten Commandments. So if we begin and we look at what's happening here, you have all these judgments. Look at verse 21, beginning verse 1. Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them. Now, again, to give the context, before we continue reading, I always like to give context, and I love it when our teachers here at Margaret Street always look at and try to show the context. Go back with me to chapter 18. Let's go back just a couple of chapters, 18, beginning in verse 14. And you might remember this. You know, here's one of the disadvantages of having a Bible study like this, where you cover things at a slow pace. Because we were in chapter 18, I don't know how long, 6 weeks ago, something like that. And I know most of you have sharp memories, and you can pull everything up much better than I can, but I can't, so I got to go back and review. And this, you remember this part of the story, this part of the account, when it said in beginning of verse 14, so when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did for the people, he said, what is this thing that you're doing for the people? Why do you alone sit? And all the people stand before you morning until evening. And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws. Because he had a direct line with God. He communicated with God, so he could ask God and settle this. But look what his father-in-law says. So Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you do is not good. Wait a minute. You're telling me that the thing that I'm giving from God, that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is, he explains, both you and these people who are with you surely will wear yourselves out. I mean, if you're trying to do this all by yourself, or this thing is too much for you, you are not able to perform it by yourself. And so, therefore, he goes and he says, you need to teach others these statutes so that they can judge. Now, keep that in mind. Let's go back to chapter 21. And that's exactly what's happening right here. Moses has written all these down. He can now hand this book of the law, this covenant pact, to the judges. And they can, and when they have a problem, they go, oh, we got this problem. They can look up, and here's the judgment. So let's begin. The first one that you're going to come across in verse 2 to 6 deals with slaves or servants. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. Now, if you buy a Hebrew servant, does anybody have any other word there besides those? Does your version of that you have say something different? Yours says slave. Okay. See, this New King James says Hebrew. If you buy a Hebrew servant, now we had servants down in Paraguay. This is part of their culture. Almost all of the houses, in the back of the house, there's a little room, and it's got usually a shower and a toilet in it, and a place for a bed. That's because all levels of society there could hire servants to come in, and they would cook or clean or take care of the babies or whatever it is that you needed them to do, because the labor wages there are so low that people would work like that all the time. And so, when you think of servant, but this says buy a Hebrew servant. Some translations go ahead and say what it is, slave. Now, when you hear the word slave, we being Americans in 2019, what's the first thing that comes to mind? When we think of slaves and slavery, what comes to your mind? What pictures do you see? African slavery. And it was horrible. I've been watching a documentary on the Civil War. Wow. They took millions of photographs, those 10 top photographs and stuff. It's incredible, the conditions and stuff that those blessed souls went under. It's horrible. Well, the thing is, that's not what we're talking about here. Not exactly the same thing. In fact, this has to do, notice it says a Hebrew servant, because there is a difference between the Hebrew servants and foreign servants or foreign slaves. Turn with me to Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25, beginning in verse 39. Here, we have these laws that he's laying out here. You get to Leviticus, he really gets more detailed. All right, he started to get into this Levitical system, and he gives more laws like here in Leviticus 25, verse 39. And if one of your brethren, okay, this is talking about the Hebrews, and this is one of your national people, national fellow brethren, who dwells by you becomes poor, and he sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. And so that's why I was asking, what word do you have in your version? Because it is the word servant. And that, he wants to emphasize that, servant. He's not a slave. The same thing. Bond servant. Being a servant under a bond. Now, skip down to verse 44. And as for your male and female slaves, whom you may have from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. So you see, he's making a difference between Hebrews, and in other words, the same nation, and those of other nations. So there is a difference. Now let's go back and see what he says. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go out free and pay nothing. That makes a lot more sense now when you think about it. Why is he being a servant, or why are you buying him? Because he is, we call it an indentured servant, a bond servant. He has placed himself in servitude because he cannot pay his bills. So he goes to someone and says, let me work for you. And he works off the debt. Now, according to God's law, he only works for 6 years. And then he is to go free and not pay any more. If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, and he has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. You see, some think that here the Bible created slavery or is perpetuating slavery, and that's just simply not the truth. What you're going to see as you get further into studying about how the Bible, how God, the Mosaic Law deals with slaves, it actually does things to eliminate slavery, to make sure that every individual is treated fairly. It doesn't matter if they're a slave or not. And so he says, talking about what happens with that. But, verse 5, if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door, or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. Does that sound familiar? That song that we sing, pierce my ear, O Lord. You know that song that we sing from time to time? That's where the song comes from. But what are we talking about here? Talking about someone who decides, you know what? I like it here. I like working for this one. And so he does this. This is interesting, by the way. Talking with Jack about this last week. Bring him to the judges. Does your version that you have a different word there than judges? Anybody? Yours says God. Now, why would yours say God and ours says judges? The reason being is because the word that's there, that Hebrew word, is the word Elohim. You've heard that word before, Elohim? That's one of the words that we use for the word God. Now, why would they put judges here? Well, we're going to talk about that again in just a little bit, or some more in just a little bit. But here, you could say to bring him before God. Even before those judges, you're still doing it before God. Because why is he doing this? Why does he want to submit to this master? Go back to verse 5. What's the reason? I've got it circled, and that word circled in my Bible. Love. I love my master. See, when you think of slavery, going back to those pictures we were talking about in the Civil War and stuff like that, you know, a lot of those slaves, I don't think they loved their master very much with the way that they were treated. So what does this tell you? It tells you how these people are being treated. So he's brought to a door, and so right on the edge of the door, like this edge right here, he puts his ear up against that edge, and then he pierces it with an awl. It's kind of like an ice pick. Basically, just like you would, like a lot of little girls, I guess, We don't do it that way with little girls, though, thank goodness. But we put the ear against there and put that hole in there to show as a symbol. It's a perpetual symbol of perpetual servitude. Now, does that have a spiritual application for us? I see a few heads shaking. What's your thinking? I love my master. You know, we are slaves one way or the other. You're either a slave to sin or you are a slave to righteousness, one or the other. And so it's as simple as that. So beautiful story there in that symbol that we see here. And then he continues. The next section, verse 7 through 11, continues with slaves, but this time talking about if they're bought as wives. And if a man sells his daughter to be a maidservant, and I know that sounds horrible, but that used to happen. And you see this throughout all kinds of cultures. Even in some tribal cultures today, daughters can be sold, especially when you're trying to make an agreement between nations or something like that. You will see daughters being sold or exchanged or something like that. You see that throughout the monarchies of Great Britain and all the different things that happen in there. So if he sells his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. Backing up to verse 2. That rule does not apply to her. If she does not please her master, who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her. You know, when I read that, I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. If he dealt deceitful with her, is he not going to be deceitful anymore? But God is trying to protect these women here. And if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. Now, the custom of daughters depends on the culture you're in. In this case, the Hebrew culture, there was this dowry. You had to purchase, you had to buy this dowry as part of the duty of marriage. And that could be several different things. It could be cows, it could be all kinds of different things that are part of this dowry. It's her possessions and things. God is concerned about how we treat each other. And so, what is the human tendency when it comes to something like this? Especially in this case, I want you to go back in this culture when women were not regarded as women are today. And they were, and this is put in the same context of slaves. What's the human tendency of how to treat that human being? What was that? Ugly. That's right. Ugly. Man's inhumanity to man manifests itself all the time. And so, by the way, that's where the devotion came from, is reading through this kind of stuff, thinking, man, the way that we treat each other. And so, if he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, her marriage rights, and if he does not do these three for her, then she shall go out free without paying money. In other words, hitting him right in the pocketbook. That's what you ever really want to get to somebody, hit them in the pocketbook. And so that's what God is protecting here. He understands that a slave woman does not have any protection, doesn't have any means of providing for herself, is vulnerable. And so he makes this provision and care for her. Any questions or comments at this point? Yes.
One of the things that, as sensitive 21st century Americans, these things sort of are bothersome to us, you know. But if the Lord is coming and the earth still stands 1,000 years from now, they're going to look back at 2019 and say, they did this crazy thing. You know, I can't believe I don't know what it would be, ate meat for some weird, you know, I can't believe they killed an animal. That's disgusting to us, you know. And if God were revealing his will right now, he would be regulating how we do things according to our cultural sensitivities and our customs today.
Absolutely.
Not 1,000 years from now. So when we look back at Exodus, we say, why didn't God just tell them, look, y'all were slaves in Egypt. You don't need to have slaves. You know, why did he even, this was their cultural time, and God does not dictate to man other than, you know, the absolute moral things, how he's going to regulate these sorts of things in commerce and transactions. But when we look at
Yes.
When
Yes.
you say a woman is to be treated well, she's to be treated fairly, that's radical, one of your own kind sells himself into indentured servitude would probably be the way we think about it. And then you have to treat him well and let him go without paying, and after 7 years, regardless, maybe if he was a sluggard that whole 7 years. This is radical stuff to them. To us, it's very weird, but that's the way it has to be looked at.
Radical for the cultures of the time. Going back to chapter 19, verse 5, when he says, you will be my people. See what he's doing here and what he's going to show, and it continues. It doesn't stop here. Like I said last week, this is actually this is the first collection of 4 of this collection of precepts. And each time it gets a little bit more detailed. So detailed that he even gets down to the point of you shall not cut your hair, trim your beards, or mark yourself or cut yourself like the other nations do. I don't know if you ever spend any time looking at other cultures, but whenever you go out of the country, you can go to the other side of the country sometimes and see this, but especially go to other countries, you'll notice people's hair is different. Their beards are different. The way they carry, there's different things about them, the way they look. Well, this is what God was doing with his people, and it translates even into things like slaves. The way you treat a slave is different. Why? Why is God doing all this? So that the nations will know that I am God. I am holy, and you are my holy people. That's why he's doing all this. Great point, Scott. Thank you. So now you get into verse 12, you get into laws concerning personal injury. And there's a lot of great things here, and quite honestly, to unpack every single thing that's here, we would be here for weeks and upon weeks. So I'm going to kind of move through some of this a little faster. He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. We're talking about capital punishment here. All right, so God himself says you kill somebody, you're going to be killed. And he gets more specific about that in just a few verses down. But, see, there's a comparison. If he did not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then I will point for you a place where he may flee. So, what do we have here? We have premeditated murder versus manslaughter or accidental, second degree, third degree murder. He didn't lie in wait. He didn't intend to kill this person. And that part about God, I don't know what your version says, but God delivered him into his hand. Simply that God allowed it to happen. In other words, this is part of, sin, quite frankly. This is God is allowing these things to happen. Think back to Job, how he allowed those things to happen. So here he says, I will point for you a place where he may flee. Now, if you go to Numbers chapter 35, Numbers chapter 35 talks about these cities, these sanctuary cities, these cities of refuge. And it says in Numbers 35 that if a man kills somebody, and basically he needs to be presumed innocent before, it needs to be presumed innocent at first. And so he can go to this city of refuge so that the avenger, the one who's trying to avenge his loved one that's been killed, he can go there and be safe until he can be delivered to a council and judgment be made. Now, there's some other things that happen that without a doubt, if there's testimony, if there's eyewitnesses that he is a murderer, he did it, it was premeditated, then the city of refuge doesn't work. You can run there if you want to. They're just going to kick you right back out and you're going to die. So there's more laws that God's going to get into, but right now he's just kind of giving a little synopsis, a little preview of that. Yes. 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 Yeah, it starts getting very specific. That's right. Very specific about how those cities of refuge work. But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him with guile, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. Now, there's an interesting story that I've got to share with you on this one. When I read this, it's the first thing that came to mind. Turn with me to 2 Kings 2. 2 Kings 2, verse 28. I remember this story. As soon as I read this, I said 2 Kings. I think I meant 1 Kings. Sorry. 1 Kings 2, verse 28. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 2, what you have is David is dying. He has died. He has put Solomon in charge. But before David died, he told his son Solomon, there's a little bit of business you need to take care of. And that is some people who were part of his entourage who had committed some things in the past that need to be answered for. Joab was one of those. And so, verse 28, the news came to Joab, for Joab had defected to Adonijah, though he had not defected to Absalom. If you remember that story of that whenever they usurped the throne of David and everything and all that happened, Joab was picking sides and he picked the wrong side. So Joab fled to the tabernacle of the Lord and took hold of the horns of the altar. You see, this was one of the parts of their culture, part of their law, that it was kind of like a city of refuge. You could go there and grab a hold of the horns of the altar and nobody could touch you. It's kind of like, well, not 100% these days, but kind of like there used to be respect for churches. Somebody wouldn't pursue you into a church if they were trying to kill you. And so somebody could run into a church and find safety there. Well, that only applies if they're still working on trying to figure out are you guilty or not. But if you're guilty, they'll drag you right out of there and kill you. And that's what you see in the rest of this story. Now go back to what it says here. It says, if the man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him with guile, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. In other words, sorry, if you did it premeditated, there's no sanctuary for you. Even grabbing the horns of the altar is not going to save you. That's what he's talking about there. And he who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Now I want to jump to the next one there. Look in verse 17. And he who curses his father and his mother shall surely be put to death. My, how times have changed. And I'm glad because I'll probably be dead right now. I never struck my parents. But... And I actually can't say that I cursed my parents either, but I don't know. I don't want to blur the line there. I don't want to. Now, let me clarify something. This is the maximum sentence, okay? That's one thing we need to realize. God, just like our laws today, are there maximum sentences for certain laws? Yeah, there's maximum sentences. Does that mean the judge has to give that maximum sentence? No. In fact, we're going to see that in a little bit later whenever it talks about that there can be some leniency there. All right? He who kidnaps a man and sells him, verse 16, if he is found in his hands, shall surely be put to death. All right? So these are guidelines, stipulations, precepts, laws that God has given Moses to help them make these judgments. If men contend with each other, and one strikes the other with a stone or his fist, and he does not die, but is confined to his bed, if he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, I love all the little details that they put in there, then he who struck him shall be acquitted. All right? He shall only pay for the loss of his time and shall provide for him to be thoroughly healed. That's the key right there. Again, all of this has to do with individual rights. God is concerned about everyone. And he's trying to teach the people to have compassion and to be responsible and that your actions have consequences. That's what he's trying to teach. He continues, and if a man beats his servant or his maidservant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. I'm sorry, I got a little bit of a warped mind here, but I'm thinking, so that might be where the phrase, beat them within an inch of their life comes from. Because if he lives for a couple of days, I won't get in trouble. You know? It's interesting, the details. You know, servants, going back to what Scott said a minute ago, servants were worthless in other societies. In the pagan societies, they were nothing. They was just... And if you wanted to, is your property. If you want to destroy your property, it's your prerogative. But in this case, God is saying, no. There is punishment involved. You're not going to treat people that way. Then he goes on, if men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no lasting harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes upon him. Let me tell you something. Somebody injures Andrea, that person is going to pay dearly. Okay? But look at the next part. And he shall pay as the judges determine. So it's not just the husband making this. And let me tell you, down in Paraguay, you get in a car accident or you have any kind of a litigation, a problem with somebody, especially a car accident. I mean, cousins and the whole family comes out of the woodworks, and you've got to provide for them or give them a little bit of money. Or it's incredible, the things that happen. Well, fortunately, you can get, they have these kind of like mini judges, I guess you could call them. They're kind of in between a lawyer and a paralegal, sort of. You can get a piece of paper, a document from them that's saying this is closed, you've already dealt with the principal person, and nobody else gets anything. And that's what he's doing here. It's like they shall pay according to the judges. Then we get into probably one of the most famous or well-known laws, and it's one that Jesus even quotes in Matthew. But if any lasting harm follows. Now remember, we're talking about personal injury here. If you injure somebody, you hurt somebody, you kill somebody or something like that, if any lasting harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Anybody know what this law, this verse 23 through 25 is called? It has a name. Anybody? It's called lex talionis. Have you ever heard that? Lex talionis is what this is called. That's Latin. Lex is the word for law in Latin, in the Latin language. And taliona, or talionis, is where we get our word retaliation. So it is the law of retaliation. So, now that's what we call it. That's what the thing about Latin, that comes many years later, and it's called the law of retaliation. But if you look at the context of what God is saying here, is he saying you need to retaliate against this? No. What God is saying here is that the punishment must fit the crime. Does that make sense? The punishment must fit the crime. Simple as that. Now, Christ quoted this, but he did not repudiate it. Did I say that word right? Didn't come out. Didn't sound right when it came out. Go with me to Matthew chapter 5, verse 38. Matthew chapter 5. You remember this. Whenever he would quote these laws, he's going down through these laws. You've heard it said. And then he would quote a law, but I say, well, he quotes lex talionis, or that section of the law that we just read. He says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He just quotes a little part of it. We read the whole verse. So that's what he's referring to. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other one to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. Whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give him who asks of you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. All right, let's go back now to Exodus and see what's going on here, Jesus. Why are you saying this? Look at the context. What are we talking about here? Personal injury. 1 second. Personal injury, right? And he's saying that if this thing happens, the crime, the punishment must fit the crime. So essentially what he's saying is that you cannot use this for personal vengeance. There are other ways to work this out. Personal vengeance, if somebody does something to you, remember going back to the maximum sentence idea, doesn't mean that you have to. If somebody, tit for tat and things like that people do to each other, you don't have to do that. And that's what Jesus is saying. Turn the cheek. Give them your cloak. You can work this out in other ways. Yes.
One of the versions on my phone is the Amplified Bible. And it has in parentheses in a different color the comments, the commentary, the comments that they put along with the scripture. And it says, it's talking the same type
Yeah. And go back to, just think about how, go back to what I was saying about how man is to each other. Man's inhumanity to man. Have you ever known a case, have you ever known somebody who got the book thrown at them? You know, we use that phrase. For what? They were jaywalking and they get 15 years in prison. You think, what? Or the other way around. They kill somebody somehow, like maybe by accident, and yet they're just walk scot-free. What is that? Injustice, right? That's what is what God is trying to regulate here. He wants his people to be just, to be fair, to have compassion, and to judge correctly. Am I explaining that well? And that's what it's all about. Well, that's the whole point of what Paul was saying in Romans chapter 3. I believe that's right. I have to think about that some more. But when he says, I wouldn't have known what sin is without the law. And so if I read these things and I realize, oh, okay, there are consequences for my actions. Therefore, don't do that. It's always right to do right. It's always wrong to do wrong. It's never right to do wrong. It's never wrong to do right. Right? Thank y'all for your attention. We'll pick up in verse 26. And we'll go a little faster and get through the next couple of chapters the next week. Thank you again for your attention. God bless.